There are going to be times when the edge of a brush matters. Times when you really want to recreate the look of traditional media. Well, this is a really challenging type of custom brush to make, and that's why I've left it as the last. Now that you've got a better sense for how some of these brush controls work, let's try and recreate this piece of charcoal. So it seems reasonable that a starting point would be the texture brush that we made at the very beginning of the series. So you can see that's got a nice look to it, but the ends are wrong. If you were holding a piece of chalk in your hand, it would have a hard edge on the end. Also, the edge of each stroke is too uniform, it's too sharp. So while this brush has the texture right, it doesn't have the shape right. And that means I'm going to have to try out some different tips. Now you can see I've drawn two large tips on the left here. The one on the far left is uniform, but it has a soft edge. So let's define a brush preset out of that and see how it looks. So it's got a bit of a soft edge to it, although there's some jagged staggering. We don't want that. So I'm going to turn on texture. Make sure texture each tip is selected. I'm also going to turn on transfer, which is the opacity. And now let's see how this looks. It's looking a bit better. Now the texture is not nearly prominent enough. So I'm going to change the blending mode and the scale a bit, and it should be a little more visible. Okay. You can see here, though, that there's still a bit of a problem with the spacing. So I'm going to lower the spacing so there's less segmentation. All right, looking better. And you can see as I lower the spacing down, it does add a bit of lag to the brush. So it's a balancing act. But what this isn't answering is in the reference, you can see that there's sort of a darker edge to this chalk mark. And this is an artist leaning into their stroke and putting a little bit more pressure on one corner of that piece of chalk, just because of the way they're holding it. And that gives the brush a certain amount of character, a character that's being totally lost in this brush. This is totally flat, totally uniform. So let's try out this second tip. I'll select a marquee around it, and you notice that this has a dark edge, and then it fades down to less pressure. And that's going to try and mimic this sense of leaning into the chalk mark. So I'll define a new brush preset. And let's see how this one looks. That is getting closer. Now, same problems here. I have to adjust my spacing a bit, turn on some texture. I'm going to lower the flow of this brush a little bit as well. Sometimes these look better with less pigment being laid down. Work on my spacing. That's getting closer. Now there's one problem with this, which is the angle direction is not right. It's very unlikely that as I made brush strokes with this charcoal, I'd be always holding it perfectly vertical. So that's going to be a case of shape dynamics, specifically angle jitter. I don't want any randomness, so I'm going to keep the how much at 0%. But then I want to set the control to direction. And this is just like those linear repeat brushes. Now it's got a much more naturalistic stroke to it. So this is really starting to look a bit like the character we were going for. Another opportunity would be to change the control to initial direction. And this is going to be a little bit different. So once you start your stroke, it'll stay in one direction. But that direction changes based on the angle that you make the stroke at. Now, I find this difficult to control, but if you like it, this can be a really interesting look. It would have a very different behavior than setting the control to direction. But for me, I'm going to call this one direction. I also want to turn on transfer so I have a little bit better opacity. And you can see that this is quickly turning very close to that reference. It's got a really naturalistic look to it. Now there are still minor tweaks you could do. Making a natural brush like this is all about subtlety, So it's going to take a while to refine it. One thing you can do back in Shape Dynamics is to add in a tiny bit of randomness to the angle jitter. And this will just rough up the stroke a tiny bit. And this changes the character of the brush. Is this what you're going for? Well, it's probably not quite right for the brush I'm doing, but it might be useful for a certain type of paper texture. Also, the specific pattern that I load in as the paper texture is going to matter a lot for a brush like this. A lot of what you think of as Vine charcoal is about the type of paper you're drawing on. So if you were to draw with Vine charcoal on top of a very different surface, it wouldn't really look the same at all. So when you're looking at your reference, look carefully at what type of paper or what type of canvas is your medium being used on, because that's going to tell you a lot about how to make this reproduction. Now, I can tell you from experience, successfully recreating the look and feel of traditional materials like this is really tough. It's going to take a lot of refining most of the times. Sometimes the illusion is a lot easier to figure out if you give yourself a bit of a paper texture to draw on top of. Something about drawing on a perfectly white surface really tricks the brain, and it makes any brush you're working on look less natural. So if you just put a nice paper texture layer below what you're working on, it might seem a little bit more like that result you're going for. Also, oftentimes pure black is not the color your media is. Charcoal is kind of a medium gray, so it might look a little bit more realistic if you did it with gray. These are subtle tricks, but really what you're looking for is all about subtlety. So if you really want to create some traditional media, it's going to be hard work, but at the end is really worth it. Having a nice pencil or charcoal brush can be extremely satisfying, and sometimes trick people into thinking you're not working digitally at all. So good luck with it.